All right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Dr. Nicholas Wright. He's a member of the Royal Colleges of Physicians and a PhD neuroscientist who researches the brain, technology, and security, which includes military security, at University College London, Georgetown University, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he also advises the Pentagon Joint Staff. Oh, I have to ask about that. He works with governments and the private sector. He's worked as a neurology doctor in London and Oxford and has published numerous academic papers which have been covered by the BBC and the New York Times. He's appeared on CNN and the BBC and regularly contributes to outlets like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and Slate. Here's his new book, Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. Nicholas, I read this book in Hawaii on vacation, and my wife was like, that's a cheery book to be reading on vacation.
Well, it ends on an optimistic note.
That's
so
true.
hopefully you said that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. All right. So before we dive into your book, which I really loved, it's a great read. So
Thank
interesting. I'm the perfect host for you because I've watched all those World War II documentaries, every one I can find on Netflix and Amazon Prime, Hitler in Color, Front Lines of World War II, Turning Points of World War II,
Yeah.
The Battle of Midway. I've seen every documentary on it, including the dramatization of it from 2019. Great film. I love all that stuff.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, how'd you get into psychology, social sciences in general, and then specifically neuroscience and neurology and all that, and then transitioning into studying war and the brain and all that?
Yeah. So I was a neurology doctor, as you said, and I was practicing neurology in Oxford at the big hospital there, and in London at a research institute and hospital called around a little square in London called Queen Square. And I was working there, but I always wanted to research the brain as well. And so I then spent a number of years at Queen Square at this little research institute in London using functional brain scanning, using brain scanners to look at how people make decisions about risks and rewards and punishments and so on, using brain scanning and also computational techniques, so modeling things using computers. And I did all of that at the lab that DeepMind was spun out of. If you've heard of DeepMind, the sort of, AI pioneers.
Oh, yeah. They're huge.
So it was a really exciting place to work and study the brain. And that's where I was doing my research. And then I'm afraid I got too into the research and I didn't go back to medicine. And I continued in research, looking at the brain. But I always really wanted to apply that to real world decisions and real world decisions that matter. And I was thinking about where best to apply our new understanding of the brain. And I thought, warfare. This is an area that people, we were at the end of history. Steven Pinker was saying, that don't worry, guys, it's going to be fine. The better ranges of our nature will take over. So I decided to apply our new understanding of the brain to warfare. And I went to Washington, D.C., where I worked at one of the big think tanks. And studying, applying our ideas about the brain to decision-making in nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy. That's where I got to know the people at the Pentagon, and I've worked with the Pentagon, and I've been interacting with people at DARPA and all of those types of places now for over 10 years. And that is how I've got here today.
Nice. Yeah, one slight correction on the Pinker. Steve's one of my best friends. I know him very well.
Well, there we go.
And how you described it is how everybody describes his book. What he's really saying is that there's nothing inevitable about it. There's no magic. There's no forces of nature leading us to, become peaceful. It's that we're doing things to make the world more peaceful. Or, as he's recently said, with the invasion of Ukraine, the whole Gaza situation, and so on. Maybe China and Taiwan, things could go backwards just because we're doing the other things that we shouldn't be doing anyway. So, so what's it like to walk into the Pentagon? What do they do there?
Well,
is it the deep state?
Well, in a way, yes. Obviously, it is literally. It is literally the Pentagon. So there is a metro station. You get out of you can drive there, or you can get out of the metro station. You go through airport style security. You walk in. There is a waiting area. There are often groups of school children there or young people. There's a podium where you can pretend you're the Pentagon, the Pentagon announcer, if you so choose. And then, so as a foreigner in the now Department of War, I will always be accompanied. I'll always be escorted. And the Pentagon's absolutely enormous. It is huge. And you'll be I'll be escorted through the Pentagon. You might go and have lunch, for example, in the pentagonal courtyard, not a quadrangle, a pentagonal courtyard with a cafe in the middle. There's a Best Buy, or there certainly used to be a Best Buy in the Pentagon. It's just so enormous. And you walk through corridors, and those corridors tell you a lot, actually, because there are, for example, I remember once I was taken to see a gold-plated AK-47 captured by Saddam Hussein, captured from Saddam Hussein's troops. But you also see things like, for example, I work with the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. That's who I work with most closely, and I've worked with them very closely. They're really a fantastic group of people. I've worked with them now for over 10 years. And when you walk to their offices in the Joint Staff, you walk through the ANZUS corridor, which is about Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and World War II. So many different conflicts in which they have fought alongside each other as allies, and that's just one example of the type of thing you see there at the Pentagon.
Yeah, amazing. Should remind listeners that was built by Leslie R. Groves, who got chosen then to be on the Manhattan Project. Because if you could build a building that big, is it still the world's largest building, or at least one of them?
That is a good question. I doubt it. And even if it is, I'm sure the Chinese would build a building with one more room just to prove the point. But yes, it is very big. And of course, the other thing to remember is a chunk of it was destroyed in 9/11. So when you walk through, you see a large area, of memorial, because a lot of people died in the Pentagon, which is something people often forget as well.
That wasn't completely reconstructed. They left part of it as a memorial.
No, it is reconstructed, but there is there is a large memorial area there. But it's completely reconstructed.
Do you recall when I took a tour of the People's Palace, Ceausescu's People's Palace in Romania, that they were bragging it was the world's largest building, something like that. I don't know how you measure that in square footage, but how high do you go? Anyway, that's I'm wondering, since we're recording this a week after Charlie Kirk was assassinated.
Yeah.
It's being called a political assassination. Do you have any thoughts on that in particular, or more general, the seemingly increase in political violence and polarization, not just here, but elsewhere?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is that a country like America is unusual in that there have not been any regime changes in the United States for a long time. And Britain is also unusual for that reason. So, the US, yes, there was a civil war, but that was, well over a century ago, 160 odd years ago. If you then think about most other countries, Germany didn't even exist until after the Civil War, the American Civil War. In my lifetime, there have been at least 3 Germanys. This century, there have been about 5, 6 Germanys, depending on how you count them. France has gone through since 1848, so shortly before that American Civil War. In 1848, France has been a monarchy. It's had 3 republics and I think 4 republics and an empire. Right, it was an empire for a while as well. The Soviet Union only lasted for just over 70 years. The People's Republic of China has only just surpassed that. So the unusual thing is a country as stable as the United States or as stable as Britain. And that doesn't happen by accident. As you were saying, with Steven Pinker, as you were articulating his perspective, these things don't happen by accident. Violence is part of all of us as human beings. It's part of every society. Every society is constructed from a vortex, a spiral of our identities and the cultures of which we're a part. And often those spirals can spin out of control. They can fissure into multiple different groups that don't like each other, that are polarized. Now, that said, we do also have incredible capacities for reflection, for realizing when we've gone too far, for restraint. Is that perfect? No, but that's every bit as much a part of the human capacity as our capacity for violence. And I think that if I was going to say if there was one key thing that we should do, is that we should try, will be a long, hard road, but we're going to have to rely on those human capacities for restraint, for wisdom, for self-reflection. It's not as exciting as aggression and unpleasantness, but that's how we've made the wonderful societies in which we do actually live.
Mm-hmm. Nicely said. Yeah, I wrote here in my book, The Moral Arc, historically, regime change through political assassination was not all that uncommon. In a study of 1,513 European monarchs who ruled between AD 600 and 1800, for example, the criminologist Manuel Eisner found that 227 of them, or 15%, were assassinated in coups d'etats. That's a large enough number to make most of us constructively conspiratorial about the machinations of backroom operatives plotting to overthrow a leader or administration. And then I gave lots of examples: assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the assassination of the Romanov family, and here we've had Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and JFK all assassinated, and then another half a dozen presidents that were shot at but missed. So maybe it's the recency effect, the availability heuristic. We see these things bouncing around social media. Seems like it's worse. Maybe there's always been difficulties, and these are the exceptions, actually, that the United States has not had a violent regime change.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's very unfashionable to say, but I think the United States is in important ways an exceptional country. And one of the reasons, or one of the indicators of that, one of the reasons why I think it is unusual in the world is because it is unusually stable. I know it may not feel like that sitting in America right now, but it is unusually stable if you look on a more historical perspective. And the reason, a good part of that is because the United States was set up very cleverly by the founding fathers. They realized there were a number of features of how humans operate, violence, vanity, all the rest of it. They understood that humans weren't angels, and they built a great system that was reinforced over many, many, many years, because other countries can have the Constitution. The Constitution is one thing, but it's only part of the answer. And it has been reinforced. And for example, when you talked about the deep state and the Pentagon, one of the things that always makes me more sanguine about, more relaxed, is that I work with a lot of people at the Pentagon, and they are fundamentally good, decent people. There are people who are not literally like Captain America because he is a superhero, but there are people who are extremely brave, decent people, and they're just simply trying to make the world and the United States a better place.
Yeah, that's well put.
I'm not being a cheerleader for the thing, but I mean, that's my honest opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. I've been hearing since 2016 when Trump became president that, that's the end of our democracy. So every election, midterms and presidential elections, I say, all right, put your money up. You put up $1,000, I'll put up $1,000. The specific bet is, will there be an election? And no one will take me up on it. They like saying it's the end of democracy. So you're saying there won't be an election next year in 2020? I was just this morning, somebody was saying this. Yeah, that there won't be any midterm elections next year? Well, they're like, okay. Even though Trump says he thinks he won 2020, he didn't. But, people were saying he was never going to leave. He left. And Biden was president for 4 years. And then he won, and then Biden left, and now he's president again. So the system seems to be working no matter how, I don't know, volatile it seems like it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So but more generally, why do people kill in the name of politics or ideology? I mean, first of all, most people don't. Right. I mean, most, radical left activists, they don't gun down conservative activists. Most don't, but some do.
Yeah.
So what leads to that?
I mean, I think you could actually go even further and say that the majority of people who are in a war like World War II also don't kill others. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't think most people know about this. I didn't used to know about this before I sort of started working with the military and reading, and working much more closely with people. So in World War II, for example, even in an infantry, a US infantry unit, in what they would describe as a stern day's action, only perhaps a quarter of troops would actually discharge their weapons and really point them towards the enemy and try and kill the enemy. Killing is something that is quite difficult to do, just as actually standing and fighting is something that's quite difficult to do. So I think this is a much broader thing. Now, why do we kill, though? All of us, every human being, is built to win or at least survive a fight, right? Conflict. That could be human against nature or human against human. If we didn't have that as part of ourselves, then we wouldn't have survived to the point of you and I being here right now. I mean, that's just a simple explanation. Why do people fight? So the brain, there's no single simple system in the brain. The brain is a bit like an orchestra. There are many different systems within the brain. So if you think about the brainstem, so in the book, we go on a journey from the brainstem right in the base all the way through to the frontal pole, the other end, right, the very other end of the brain, which does our most sophisticated things like thinking about thinking. And what you have is you have an orchestra of brain systems, and they all contribute to make us the thinking, feeling humans that we are. And one of the, there is no single reason why we get pushed to violence in some situations. It is actually that built into all of our brain systems are drivers that drive us, or can, in some situations, drive us towards violence.
Right. So here's how I put it. Using Richard Dawkins' selfish gene model, to a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. But there's a difference between a survival machine and a rock. A survival machine is inclined to hit back if exploited.
Mm-hmm.
This is because it too is a survival machine, here I'm quoting Dawkins, that holds its immortal genes in trust for the future, and it too will stop at nothing to preserve them.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, Dawkins concludes, natural selection favors genes that control their survival machines in such a way that they make the best use of their environment. This includes making the best use of other survival machines, both of the same and different species.
Yeah.
Survival machines could evolve to be completely selfish and self-centered, but there's something that keeps their pure selfishness in check. And that is the fact that other survival machines are inclined to hit back if attacked and retaliate if exploited, and so on. So there's a kind of a logic behind it.
I think that's true, and what I would say is we don't. So there are lots of different reasons why. So that's kind of like what could be described as an ultimate cause. So why did that happen in a really far back way? But a lot of what the book is about how this actually happens in our brains, the brains that you and I are living with right now, that everyone listening to this or watching this has. So in our brains, we have, for example, systems for fear, processing fear. Now, now that is vital for our survival. Fear is crucial for our survival. There is a particular brain region that's central to how we process fear, which is called the amygdala. If you don't have an amygdala and you live in a dangerous environment, right, and there are some patients with very unusual brain conditions where they lack the amygdala and they lack fear, essentially, they don't become master criminals. They actually become victims of crime. So we need fear. Equally, I'm trying to work out what you're doing, what you want, right? I'm trying to work out your intentions. Now, your intentions may be good intentions towards me or towards other people, or they could be bad intentions. I have incredible machinery in my brain. You have incredible machinery in your brain for working out the intentions of others, because those intentions could be life and death. How do I know if you're deceiving me or you're actually trying to cooperate? Now, often we do cooperate. So the one thing I'd add to what you said there as well, in addition to making it, tightly about our brains that we have, not just, the evolutionary process that could have led to in lots of different directions. Another thing, though, is that we are able to cooperate far more over much wider contexts than any other species, right? Ants cooperate with each other. Chimps can cooperate, right? Dogs, whatever. Humans, because we have amazing machinery, like mental neural machinery for working out others' intentions, we can cooperate. I can think, Michael Shermer wants to make a good podcast and tell people interesting things. We can cooperate on this in ways that other animals can't. And that's partly because I can interpret your intentions. And so I'd say the incredible machinery we have in our brains doesn't only tend us towards violence, it also enables us to cooperate in ways that no other animal can cooperate.
Yeah, I forget who made this analogy, but if you stuck I don't know, 300 chimps in a commercial airliner at 30,000 feet, and then you started walking down the aisle with the drink and food cart, it would just be chaos.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good. I mean, the other thing is there are no chimp societies much bigger than that,
Right.
right? Humans, right, amongst all apes and primates, humans are the only ones that can get above a few hundred to form groups of thousands, which is tribes, the scale of tribes. We are the only primates that can do that. And that is quite remarkable. And then, of course, now we can go to a state now where you have 335 million Americans who are broadly speaking in some kind of, broadly coherent political community. I mean, that is a mind-boggling figure. So, humans are able to do that. How are we able to do that? We're able to do that because of our brains.
You're right. Although I should also point out there's 400 million guns in America. So if it's only 0.0001 who, are lone nuts that get violent, that's enough for it to happen. I don't know, once a week there's a mass public shooting here in the United States or a shooting of a celebrity or something like that. Yeah. Right. So, okay. So what you're talking about there is theory of mind reading. I can put myself into your head and think, what is he thinking? And I know that you can do the same and anticipate what I'm thinking. And then it becomes sort of a common knowledge problem, that, or a coordination problem, that I know that he knows that I know, and so on. And then we end up with social norms that are just sort of hovering there in the ether that don't always have to be enforced by the law, although it doesn't hurt to have the law behind them. That we all, it's a useful fiction. We have a democracy. Okay. Yeah. Or our paper currency is valuable, even though it's not really. I mean, we just kind of all agree on these things. Or you don't kill people, or you don't shove people on the into the subway or whatever. You just don't do that. And so that's part of it, I guess. Social norms interacting with individual brains.
Well, I mean, so essentially, I mean, the way I would think about it, and I describe it in the book, is that why can we create bigger and more bigger societies than any other primate? A big chunk of that is that what we can do is we can create identities. So answers to the question, who am I? I am a British person, whatever it might be. Or I'm a doctor. I'm a scientist. We can answer the question, who am I? And then in addition to that, we then have cultures that are rules. So how are things done around here? And the cultures help create the identities, and the identities help create the cultures. You can't have one without the other. And they spiral together. And that's what enables us to form incredible scale of communities that no other primate can form. And a big chunk of that is what I'm doing to you right now, which is I'm talking. I'm able to put in your mind a very specific model of how I think things are working. And I have a vision of that in my mind, and I'm giving that to you. And now we can share that model. So, I think that capacity for language turbocharges this identity culture spiral that enables our societies to function, to be coherent.
Yeah, another interesting problem in group living is free riding and bullies and people that don't go by the norms. The question is, why didn't we evolve as we were becoming more self-domesticated, as it were, to get rid of all of them and that everybody plays by the rules?
I mean, a classic answer to that would be that there is enormous variation in human populations. So we all vary along a wide variety of different aspects of our brain function, of our physical life. Now, in some situations, someone who might be a risk taker, driving too fast, or whatever as a young person, we might say, oh, they're doing it, the wrong thing. But actually, there'll be other situations where that kind of risk taking is desirable. And we have a very heterogeneous a society in which there are many people of many different types, and that actually can be a strength, and particularly a strength of Western societies, I would say, or certainly of the Western democracies, is harnessing a wide variety of different types of people. And if we were to just get rid of everybody, I mean, there have been people. Hitler, for example, was very keen on getting rid of people who didn't necessarily fit the precise mold. And fundamentally he lost. So, I would say for a wide variety of reasons, well, A, it's impossible. And also, I mean, obviously, because then you'd have children, and then your children would grow up. And why would they necessarily, for them, whatever perfect society we have, for them, that's the boring status quo. So, from an intergenerational point, you would also never be able to have that kind of society. So for all those reasons, I think it's just simply impossible.
Yeah, Christopher Bohm wrote about this in his book on the origins of morality, that natural selection only needs to get rid of most of the bullies and free riders. You can have, like there's maybe 3 to 5% psychopaths in a society. And not all of them are really bad. Some of them are really good at leading Fortune 500 companies and being stock traders in Wall Street, right? or special forces soldiers. Yeah. And you want those badasses that don't fear things and don't care about other people's feelings, right? So it's good, in other words, we could have enough group cohesiveness if most people play by the rules with some variation allowed.
Yeah. And also, if people weren't mavericks, if people weren't trying to break the rules, we'd be still stuck in the cave. We never would have got to the level of, the fact that I'm now speaking to you from literally, thousands of miles away. We would never have got to this point if everybody followed the rules. I think there's you're probably familiar, obviously, with the Maverick, Top Gun films. And you have Iceman and Maverick.
Yes.
We need both those things,
Yes.
and our brains enable us to do both those things as well. But, we need, if everybody was like Iceman, we'd still be stuck in a cave. On the other hand, if everyone was a maverick on the deck of the aircraft carrier, finding crazy, new novel ways of waving the batons or whatever, the aircraft carrier would be a disaster. So you need both of those things. You need the mavericks and you need the Iceman. And, that's in itself another way of, we need complementary people, complementary humans.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, I don't know if you know Kevin Dutton, the psychologist who writes about psychopathy. One of his books is on the positive side of psychopathy. And he tells the funniest story in that book about, it's the UK version of the Navy SEALs. I forget what it is, but they're special forces. Yep. And they put him through this whole training program. And at the very end, they got the guy laying face down with a blindfold and he's like tied up. And then they fire up a big truck engine and then they roll a big tire right up to his head. And if he doesn't flinch, that's our guy.
Yeah. I mean, if you want a recommendation, watch SAS Rogue Heroes, a TV program about the origin of the SAS. So the Navy SEALs were based on the SAS. I have to do that because I'm British. But and a good friend of mine is a retired Navy SEAL. So he'd be fine with it. But yeah, so the SAS, exactly. You need those people. You need those people who are going to break the rules, who are going to do things differently. And you need the people who are going to follow the rules and do things in the way that they're expected. Like, for example, you don't want me to decide I'm not going to turn up at the hospital because I've gone off in my Ferrari or whatever it might be. You want me to turn up, do my job, and do the right thing. Write all of the notes, do everything in a sensible and ordered fashion, so that you're hopefully going to get better as a patient.
Yeah. Okay, one of the biggest questions I've ever had in my adult life is, how do you turn a group of highly educated German citizens into goose-stepping Nazis? How did this happen? All right, you write a lot about this in your book. Kind of give us an overview of what was going on in their brains and their culture, their society.
I mean, so I think that you can't understand the run-up to World War II without understanding the run-up to World War I. And just and understanding the humans who were involved. So, all of us have in us the potential for violence. All human societies that have militaries have in them the potential for warfare. And societies that do not have militaries are extremely tempting targets for those that do have militaries. And fundamentally, the only reason why bad guys don't take over the world is simply because there are less bad guys who are there to stop them. In a way, in the run up to World War One, so now we're sitting here now, and that there hasn't been a general war between all the great powers in the world for 80 years. In 1914, there hadn't been a great power war between all the great powers for 99 years since since the Battle of Waterloo, the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So for 99 years, there hadn't been this cataclysmic great war with all of the great powers. And essentially, there was a problem of intentions. The other side didn't know, couldn't be confident. Each side couldn't be confident the other side wasn't going to try and attack them. There were fears. And essentially what happened is there was a spiral of fear and distrust. Yes, the Germans are probably more to blame, and the Austro-Hungarians are more to blame than the French or the British, but fundamentally, nobody really wanted World War One, and we ended up with World War One. You then have a very brutalized society, particularly in Germany, which lost World War One. And in addition to that, it's important to remember that the Allies could have occupied Germany at the end of World War One. The German army was beaten. It is simply not true that the German army was stabbed in the back and they could have carried on in World War One and they would have been, this is what the Nazis said. It was not true. The German field army was beaten and we decided not to occupy Germany. So Germany then became a country that it had a change of political regime. It had a lot of very brutalized people. And then it had an economic collapse. And then you had a leader, and unfortunately, it gives me no pleasure to say this because Hitler would have certainly wanted to have me dead. There's no doubt about that. Who was also an extremely skilled politician who was able to use his skills and harness millions, tens of millions of ardent followers. Now, why do we follow leaders? Now, in a way, this partly comes out of our amazing abilities to create these. We create these incredibly, powerful groups that no other primates can form. And within those groups, there will always be hierarchies. Right? There will always be social hierarchies because that helps work out how we're going to give different goods to different people and so on. There will always be social hierarchies, and there will always be leaders, and those leaders will be there for two reasons. There are two main reasons that give leaders power or authority as leaders. One is dominance, so they're more powerful. They have, I'm big and strong and all the rest of it. We have guns. The other is prestige. So we follow leaders who have something to teach us often. So we will always have leaders. Hitler assumed that leadership position. And then this is another great example where you have specific individuals who change the course of history, where Hitler then took them he led them in a terrible direction. And that, just to say, single individuals can also do really quite wonderful things. So, Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, we could all have been incinerated in a nuclear apocalypse. That is absolutely plausible end to the Cold War. Or there could have been a brutal crackdown at the end of the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And that didn't happen. So individuals can lead us to a better world, but leaders such as Hitler, obviously in that case, led those Germans to a worse world.
Yeah, that's a good start. So Hitler has a lot of public support in the 30s. I wonder if by the time, he took the country onto a war footing and is plotting to invade Poland on September 1st, 1939,
Mm-hmm.
the majority of the people were not going to be supportive of going to war, much less the extermination program against the Jews and so on.
Yep.
But it was too late. There were no more free press. Concentration camps were set up.
Yep.
Everybody could see what happens to anybody who speaks out. So you get this. So is it that, or is it also pluralistic ignorance or the spiral of silence where everybody thinks everybody else is on board with it, but they're actually not. But there's no way to communicate because there's no press.
I mean, there's never going to be one simple, single
Yeah.
answer. Um, but what I would say is that human societies will always have leaders, and there will always be followers who will want to follow leaders. And I think that's just a simple function of the fact that we are humans, right? Humans follow leaders, and leaders like to have followers following them. That is human. Um, those leaders can, in the right circumstances, take a society in an extremely, in very different directions depending on what they choose to do. So, as I said, Mikhail Gorbachev, remember, also the end of the Cold War, he didn't think he was destroying communism. He thought he was saving communism by liberalizing. He just got it all got it all wrong. And luckily for us, it all turned out very well, certainly for us in the West. Um, Hitler was a very skilled, unfortunately, very able politician and leader who led his people in a very dark direction. You are entirely correct that, for example, even in 1939, Germans didn't really want to go to war, just as the British and the French didn't really want to go to war, the populations. But in Germany, unlike in Britain and France, Hitler could simply decide they were going to go to war.
Yeah, there was
Whereas that wasn't the case
one of the
here.
33 different assassination plots to kill Hitler was just before Munich
Hmm.
in 1938. His own generals were saying, "Well, if this guy takes us to war, we have to get rid of him. We're
Yeah,
not ready for this." But then
I mean,
he got the appeasement and the signature from Chamberlain, and it's like, "Oh, okay, now we can't kill him because look, he's made peace."
yeah. Well, and there was also another thing where, again, but always an element of luck as well. So it just happens that some of the key generals lost power due to scandal at exactly the wrong moment, and that enabled Hitler to move forwards.
Mm.
So there's always an element of luck. There's always an element of individual humans. Um, and there are just the huge forces that are there because of the way all of our brains work. All of those things matter. And, it's not all the fact that we're humans or all the fact that it's to do with one specific individual or all to do with luck. It's a combination of all of them.
Yeah, for sure. Well, but to the point I was kind of leading to is
Yeah.
even if a majority of people are not on board with something, maybe they can't do anything about it. Let me give you some examples. Like
Hmm.
on slave ships, during the slave trade, you got hundreds of slaves and a dozen sailors with guns.
Yeah.
Why don't they just rush them? Or on the platform at Auschwitz, got 1,000 Jews and a dozen Nazis with guns and dogs. Just rush them. Come on. Or in this case, from your book, how did 3,000 German police handle all of occupied France? Why don't they just shoot them all and just storm them?
I mean, this is partly, you make of it, why, how can one leader, if I can't remember but you walk along any, army in the 18th century Europe, most of those troops didn't want to be there. And you have the officer walking along in front of heavily armed people, any one of whom could simply, kill him immediately. Yet none of them do. And so why is that? Partly it's about culture, but we can actually step back and look more broadly than that. So you now are looking forwards at your computer camera or whatever it is you're looking at, right? There are lots of different things you could do right now. You could, if you so choose, sort of bend your head forward and take a bite out of the microphone sponge in front of you, right? You could pick up your mouse and start throwing it in the air, right? There are lots of things you could do, but actually, you don't do almost any of those things. So what we see we can do in the world is very limited, right? We live our lives through a very small number of options out of all the almost infinite number of things that we could do. These things, so in neuroscience, these are called affordances. So what does our environment afford us to do? When I'm walking down the road and I see something in a shop window that I like, I don't just smash the glass and take it. But I could do that. right? So, what are the affordances that we see in the environment around us? And we live our lives inevitably, because just the number of possible actions we could take at any point in time are so vast. We live our lives within very narrow rules of how we physically act, how we perceive things, how we work in the social world. Everything is done within these rules, because the alternative is just, it's not anarchy. It would be nothing. It would just be an infinite possibility of random movements.
Yeah, that's interesting. Affordances. That's a good way to look at it. You also have the game theory problem called belling the cat. So the mice all get together and say, if we put a bell on the cat, we could hear him coming. And so this would be good for us. All right, who's going to do it? Because whoever's going to do it may get eaten. All right, so you go first.
No. And I think, so this is the thing. I think it's partly we have our ways of operating in the world, partly because this is how we cope with that type of problem. You are absolutely correct. Yeah, at Auschwitz, possibly, how should people have acted? But then on the other hand, I would just say I'm not sure that would necessarily have helped them in that situation. But you're right. There are people who do, but then there are people who do break the rules, who do decide to do things that are bad or good, like the chap who obviously just killed the killed the
Charlie Kirk.
exactly. But then people can also do things that involve lying, that involve deceit over many years, and that can actually be something that is good. So again, talk about World War II, but there was during World War II in France, they didn't collect data on the ethnicity of people in the census. They couldn't identify the Jews very quickly. The SS wanted to identify the Jews. And there was a chap called René Carmille, who was a senior military officer, and he said, "Look, I can help you. I'm an expert at data analysis, and I'll help you collect all of this data on, and we can work out. We can do a new census. I've got my clever machines, tabulating machines, and we can ask a question. Are you a Jew, and all the rest of it. And then we can tabulate all this data for you, and it'll be great. You can find the Jews." And so they did all of this, and the SS were very pleased, and they collected all this data and whatever. And it turned out that they just never seemed to get an answer for, like, where are all these Jews? And in the end, it turned out that René Carmille was a liar. He was actually a resistance hero who had lied the whole time in order to save the Jews. And they never got that data. Now, the Dutch, for example, and it's not a criticism of the Dutch, it's just a statement of historical fact. The Dutch very diligently collected their data. They helped the Germans find all of the Jews, and so there was a massively higher rate of death amongst the Jews in the Netherlands compared to France, where people had, in particular, René Carmille had been a liar and a cheat, and had done so for in my opinion, a good end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just watched that Netflix drama Number 24 about the Norwegian counterinsurgent activist that spent the entire war just like picking off Nazis one by one. But there's only so much one person could do. I was thinking about this. I was reading this book, Masters of the Air, about the wars over the skies of Germany. Mostly B-17 bombers. Bomber Harris, kind of orchestrating this whole thing. What was the purpose of bombing civilian cities that don't have a military industrial plant in them? Because eventually that's what they started doing. And the justification seemed to be, well, we want to make the populace so unhappy with the Nazis they'll overthrow the regime. How are they going to do that? You're going to get a group of people to march on Berlin to find Hitler at Eagle's Nest or wherever he is and say, "Hey, we're really unhappy about what you're doing here. You're out. We're putting it." This isn't going to happen. I mean, how would anybody possibly do that? That just seemed, I don't know, like a hopeless goal.
I mean, I think there are a few things about that, and it is a really important case. So one thing is, this is another great example. Strategic bombing is a great example of how the affordances we see in the world, the possibilities for action that we see in the world change over time. And this almost always happens in war. So when the British and French started World War II, we didn't bomb Germany with bombs. We bombed Germany with leaflets. We didn't want to be nasty. We didn't, they bombed us in World War I with Zeppelins, small lads bombs. But then for a wide variety of reasons, there seemed to be a bit more. The Germans bombed a British city and killed, a large number of people. And so then we bombed their city, one of their cities, and then they bombed our city and so on. And, so the one thing leads to another. So the affordances change. They bombed our city, possibly by accident, but we then took that as an affordance and bombed their city. The other thing to say is, for example, when Churchill went to see Stalin, right? And on the Eastern Front, the Russians, it's very easy. So in the siege of Leningrad alone, more Soviet citizens died than every single British and American civilian and military person in World War II. The Soviet Union suffered massively more than Britain and America did in World War II. When Churchill went over to see Stalin, almost the only thing that impressed Stalin about what any of us were doing in World War II before D-Day was strategic bombing. We were saying to the Russians, we're doing something. We are hitting back at the Germans. It was the only way we could really do it in a serious way, certainly hit their homeland. So I'd say that was really important. And the other thing to say is that we as humans have an amazing capacity for thinking about risks, right? Taking very calculated, very carefully calibrated decisions involving things like risks and rewards and punishments. So we can plan very diligently into the future, very cleverly. We're a remarkable, we have a remarkable machinery towards the front of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex for planning and thinking into the future, and for working on risks as well. And one of the things is that you can fight a war of attrition, right? It's known as a war of attrition. So military people tend to like wars of maneuver. So you have giant armies sweeping around and cavalry or tanks or whatever. But if a war of attrition can be extremely powerful. That's how Mao Zedong won in many ways in China. It was wars of attrition. That's how he ended up becoming the paramount leader of China in 1949, setting up the People's Republic of China. Wars of attrition. And actually, the Allied bombing of Germany, done by the British and the Americans, yes, it did not stop the Germans fighting. It didn't lead them to rise up. But it meant, for example, huge resources were spent by the Germans protecting their cities against our bombing. And when the Russians won their brilliant victories, for example, at the Battle of Kursk, why were there no or very few German fighter planes there to see what was happening around Stalingrad or around Kursk? It was because the fighter planes were brought back to the homeland to defend against the British and American bombers. So we criticized the bombing, but it did work, and it was one of the only things we could do for a large chunk of the war.
So interesting. Yes, that makes complete sense. Right. Absolutely. I should point out that counter to my previous examples, Gandhi famously said, if we can unite in nonviolent protest against the British, 300,000 British officers cannot control 300 million Indians.
Yeah.
And so it's really a coordination game.
But that again, though, you're right. But it's also about affordances. How, if you don't believe that you can do it, then you won't do it.
Right.
If it's not one of the options you see in the world, you won't do it. I literally, yesterday, I was in the House of Lords in Britain for an interesting reason. I was there to give a talk about AI in the House of Lords. And I walked through, and you walk through Westminster Hall, which was built in the 13th century, and why do people not, why do we still have a monarchy? Why, of the G7 countries, Britain is a monarchy, Canada's a monarchy, Japan has a monarchy, America has political dynasties, certainly. People don't tend to rise up. And why is that? Because often you just do not feel that is something that is in the plausible set of options that you could do, even though there's nothing to stop me, or anyone else actually often doing something. We just don't see it as one of our...
Right?
Only it's more fundamental than that.
Mm.
It's more fundamental than that, because it's not just about what the social norms are, just one of the ways in which we see our options in society as being, our options in life as being, you know, constrained or defined. That's just one of the ways.
All right, you write about models, that our brains make models of the world. A model is a process that describes how senses can be linked to actions that help the organism achieve its goals. And
Hmm.
this is an if-then process. If I sense X, then I should do Y,
Yep.
and so on. So then you talk about predictions and prediction error,
Hmm.
which leads to learning and constantly correcting. So maybe
Yep.
talk about that a little bit, and then we could return to World War II and back to Chamberlain's appeasement, which is now, in hindsight, considered to be terrible. Like, how could Trump meet with Putin? Oh my God, this is like Chamberlain meeting with Hitler. But without hindsight, maybe that wasn't such a bad prediction to make.
Yeah. So yeah, so the concept of a model is central to how modern neuroscience, how neuroscientists like me think about how the brain works. Um, so as you said, it's very simple. In fact, you don't even need everything with a brain essentially has this model, which is, yeah, there are senses, could be visual, it could be, smell, could be whatever it is. And then we have a brain in order to link that to actions, moving or eating or secreting things, whatever it might be, in order to achieve our goals. Goals that are very most basic are maintaining order within our own body, and successfully reproducing. So those are our models. But obviously, as you get more complicated animals, those models get enormously more complicated, and you layer on more and more and more and more fantastic, wonderful, remarkable, brilliant layers of machinery on top of the basics. So, to give you an example, a fly, um, the fruit flies that you might have if you have a bowl of cherries or whatever, and you leave them a bit too long in the kitchen. Fruit flies that you have in your own house, they actually fight duels. So if you can slow down, if you take very high speed footage of them and then you slow down, you can see them fighting these duels against each other. They fight each other, and they will do things like the lunge. They will fence with their forelegs. Female fruit flies, their favoured maneuver is the headbutt. So that's how they fight. They have a relatively limited repertoire of these ways that they fight when they do their duels. Now, we have enormously more complex brains that can do so much more than that. Um, and our models in fact, don't just link senses to actions in that way, but we can also simulate, uh, you know, entire worlds within our brains. So, to give you an example, we make a model of the physical world. So right now in your brain, there's a region called the hippocampus, or hippocampal entorhinal cortex. There is a model of your office or whichever room you're in, the routes leading to it and from it, where things are on your desk. And there is literally a model of the physical world, a map. It's not a metaphor, it's literally in there in your brain. And we know this. So this was a chap called John O'Keefe, who was at my university in London. He won a Nobel Prize in 2014 for this. So you put an array of electrodes in a rodent's brain, and you can read out from the electrodes where the rat is, okay, precisely in the real world, just from their brain. It's really remarkable. It's incredible videos on the internet. Now, these models enable us, so we have more sophisticated ways that we also look at these models of space, these maps in our brains, these literal maps in our brains. And we can plan how we might navigate from A to B, avoiding position C or whatever it might be. And we can do things that would be too dangerous. We can simulate them in our minds and simulate ways of doing things that would be too dangerous to just do in the real world. So these are our models, right? And we use these models. And then we even, at the very other end of our brain, the frontal pole, the very most sophisticated machinery we have, right? We even have models of ourselves. We can think about our own thinking. So you sitting there, Michael, have a model of Michael. You can interrogate, what did Michael just do? What did Michael just think? Was I now really sure about that? Did I really want to eat that second donut? Or do I didn't see you eating a donut, but you know what I mean? So these models are just fundamental to how everything works. But of course, whilst these models are very useful, we also need these models to be linked to reality. We have a map, so going back to the map of the physical world, our map needs to be anchored to reality in order to be useful for us. To help us navigate the world, it has to be anchored to reality.
Correspondence theory of truth.
Oh, okay. Well, you've taught me something. But just to say, and just to say, and one of the ways that we need to anchor it to reality, or change, is that we need to change our models when reality changes. Right? If I ring a little tinkly bell and you get a piece of chocolate, and you never learnt that actually sometimes when after a while I stop giving you a piece of chocolate after I ring the tinkly bell. If you never learnt that bell now no longer predicts chocolate, then you would continue, doing whatever I wanted whenever I rang the bell. So you learn, you have to be able to change your models. And the way we change is when we get our predictions wrong. Our models make predictions about the world. And when those predictions are wrong, that's called a prediction error. And then we use that learning signal. It tells us, hold on, there's a problem here in our model. We need to update our model of the world, and then we can update and learn and update our model of the world and make our model of the world better in whatever way we're thinking about at that time.
Nice. So in Chamberlain's case, his priors were that no one wants war, appeasement often works, so we're going to try that. And so he makes that prediction, and then it fails ultimately. So okay, we learn from that, but doesn't mean it always fails.
No, I mean, and this again, I mean, I think this is. I remember years ago I read there's a brilliant book, probably remains the best book on psychology and international politics. It's written by a chap called Robert Jervis, who died a few years ago, sadly, but I had the pleasure of meeting him a number of times, talking about these types of issues. And in his famous book written in the mid-1970s, I remember reading this, I was like, this explains so much. In the run-up to World War I, nobody really wanted to go, the great powers, Britain, France, Germany, nobody really wanted to go to war, right? But they didn't know that the other side didn't really want to go to war, and things spiraled upwards and we ended up in a war, right? There was uncertainty about the other side's intentions, and that led to war there, because even though we didn't want to go to war, we ended up in a war. So a lot of what Chamberlain did was learn from World War I. He was like, if we'd all been a bit nicer to each other in some ways, I'm obviously
and
oversimplifying.
Talk to each other.
Yeah. If we were nice to each other and talked to each other, then actually we wouldn't have had World War I, and we wouldn't have the cataclysm of World War I, and we should just be nicer, right? The problem is that Adolf Hitler definitely did want to have a war, and there was absolutely nothing we could have done in terms of being nicer to him that would have stopped him wanting to go to war. So this is the fundamental problem, is that we can never know whether we're in the run-up to World War I or where we try, basically being nicer is the right thing, or we're in the run-up to World War II, where fundamentally what we needed to do, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, was be tougher.
Mm-hmm.
And we can never, ever resolve that uncertainty about others' intentions, because those intentions reside within their brains.
And I do wonder, like, to use Putin as an example. I mean, I think it's good that Trump meets with him. I mean, talking is at least a good start. He's probably more like Hitler than somebody that can be reasoned with, but you don't know for sure. And I often sometimes wonder if he even knows what he's going to do. Maybe Putin has a bunch of options and affordances in his own brain, and he just wakes up one day and goes, you know what, today's the day I'm going to invade Ukraine. Fuck it, let's just go. And maybe he hadn't thought about it that carefully, or maybe he hadn't picked a date or whatever. And so, that makes the prediction problem even harder.
I mean, you're totally right. And the other thing to remember is, and I think that the thing is, it's always easy with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
But certainly with the benefit of hindsight, I think had we been much tougher back in 2021, Well, really in 2014 was the thing. So in 2014,
Right.
he sent his little green men in to Crimea, and we did essentially nothing at all. Um, and he then, that was really the time. We should have just been tougher at that time. But
But
that
what?
said,
Yeah, I know. But
yeah,
what would that look like? I mean, Obama himself. What am I supposed to do? Send the troops in? Send NATO in, and then it escalates into nuclear war? Those are hard.
no, these are very hard questions, and I think one of the challenges, Simon, I literally was having a discussion about Vladimir Putin today because that's part of my job. Um, what does he want?
Right.
Um, how should we play it? And the fundamental challenge is that he has lots of options, and if he wants to send his troops into Ukraine, there is just fundamentally, we aren't going. There is no Western country that cares, or certainly didn't care back then, sufficiently to put its own troops uh, in harm's way in a really big way in Ukraine, and that was a simple fact. Eventually, though, we will. You know, countries like Britain and France, fundamentally, in my opinion, in the end, will stand up. If he invaded Poland, which is not impossible in a serious way, we would do something about it. And one of the big dangers we have is that he doesn't understand our intentions. Right? We're the flabby liberal
Mm.
democracies. He will never do anything. But the thing is this is exactly what Hitler thought. And fundamentally, Britain and France did go to war for Poland in 1939. We didn't make a very good fist of it. I completely agree with that. But we did actually do it in the end.
Yeah.
That was Neville Chamberlain who went to war in 1939 over Poland.
Another one of my favorite examples of your prediction error issue from the Battle of Midway. There's that scene in the film that they reconstruct nicely where they're doing war games before, and one of the Japanese admirals sinks three of the Japanese aircraft carriers, and the boss comes in and says, "What's going on here?" Well, I put him up here. I didn't have him coming from Oahu. I had him way up here hiding. Well, they're not going to do that because they won't know we're coming. Like,
Yeah.
okay, but what if they do know we're coming? Well, they're not going to know. Well, we did because we broke their code and they didn't know we broke their code.
That was amazing. Yeah, incredible code breakers. And then that gave the US Nimitz expectations. His model, he could predict where the Japanese were going to be. He knew they were going to attack Midway through series of very clever code breaking things, which I love. I could talk about for a long time, but I'm not going. I'm going to resist. I'm going to resist the temptation.
No, it's
But
so interesting.
yeah,
And this last summer, I was at Bletchley Park and I toured the whole code breaking thing and all that stuff. So,
yeah,
in the movie, The Imitation Game, there's that scene where, they've cracked the code. They know that the German submarines are about to sink a bunch of ships in this convoy. We better send a signal out. And the boss is like, no, no, no. Because if they know that we know that they're about to do this, they're going to know we cracked their code.
yeah.
And so I asked the guy about that, the guy who was leading the tour there. And he said, well, what they would do in that case is they would send like an airplane over there to make sure that the Germans see that we found out about what they're doing from our airplane, not from the code breaking.
Yeah. I mean, so, and this is so there is so much about warfare. So, I mean, there's a famous Churchill is a man of a million quotes, only 5 of which are real quotes. But
Yes.
one of his famous quotes is that in war, truth is so precious it must be have a accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. Warfare is
Right.
fundamentally so much of that is about deceit.
That's mind
We as
reading.
humans have inbuilt within us enormously sophisticated machinery for working out what other people are doing, whether they're lying to us, because lying is so fundamentally human.
Mm-hmm.
Even I'm in the park, I'm playing a game of tennis, and I can choose to hit, down the line or across the court. If I said to my opponent I'm not a great tennis player, I'm just like a guy in the park. If I said, I'm going to hit it down the line now every time, or I'm going to lob now, so don't run. I mean, there wouldn't be much fun in the game. Lying. Why do we pay to go and see magicians?
Mm-hmm.
we pay to be fooled. Why do we watch films like that? Why do lying is so fundamental to what it is to be human, and it's often not even deliberate lying.
Oh, you talk about
Um,
that, the surprise, prediction and surprise.
yeah,
Maybe the surprise is kind of enjoyable. Like it's fun to watch a magic. And it's actually not fun. I know a lot of magicians, so I know a
yeah.
lot of how the tricks are done. And it's always disappointing. It's like, well, now I know that's not fun at all. It's
Well,
more fun to
and
just be
surprise is
surprised.
so important. So, I remember years ago, I gave a keynote talk at DARPA, the place that invented the
Yeah.
internet and all that kind of stuff. And we were talking about social media and how they could detect social media and bad actors and all the rest of it. And I was talking about prediction error, the idea that things that are surprising or novel, or new or different, they're things that attract our attention, that make us change our models, that have a big psychological impact upon us. And I talked about and there was an Australian Army, a retired Australian Army officer there who was a very sort of well-known counterinsurgency guy who'd done a lot of stuff with General Petraeus and so on, called David Kilcullen. I was talking about his ideas and so on. Then the next person I put up on the big screen was Taylor Swift. And the reason is that she said, she was a brilliant businesswoman. And this was, a few years ago before she became as rich as she is now. She was already one of the richest self-made women in America. And what she said is that in the future there will be people who get who don't get big social media followings because they have record contracts. They'll get record contracts because they have big social media followings. This sounds obvious
Mm,
now, but this was
mhm.
not obvious, a few years ago. And she said, how do I, maintain my relationship with my fans? You give them little surprises, right?
Mm.
You give them little surprises. So she said, I don't mean shock. I mean surprise. For example, my wife, I come home and I give her a nice little surprise. If I only ever do a nice thing for her when I've done something wrong or whatever, that would be a disaster. But it's nice to just do little surprises. It's nice to do little things. It keeps things interesting. It's pleasing. Surprises are important, and it's the same on social media. So actually, then there was a giant MIT. I don't only do Taylor Swift stories when I'm a DARPA, but there's a big MIT study, and one of the things that showed how effective social media posts is how novel or surprising were they. The more novel and surprising they were, the further they got, the more prediction error they engendered. The bigger the impact, the more likely people were to share them.
Oh, that's good to know because usually it's just the more negative you are, the more likes you get or the more the retweets you get. There's a theory of humor that's along those lines where there's a
Hmm.
surprise twist, the punchline. I'll give you two examples just for fun. So this guy's walking down New York City and he sees this Orthodox Jew with a parrot on his shoulder and he goes, "Oh, that's really cool. Where'd you get it?" And the parrot says, "Brooklyn. They're all over the place."
Yeah, yeah.
And then the other one. So this is actually a joke to make fun of academics. So it could be anybody, a computational biologist or an economist or a philosopher, goes to the sheep farm in Montana and runs across a sheep farmer out there with his herd and says,
Mhm.
"Hey, listen, if I could tell you how many head of sheep you have in your herd, can I have one of them?" And the farmer's like, "Okay, sure." He goes, 83. And he goes, "Oh my God, that's right." So the philosopher, economist, or whoever grabs his prize and starts to walk off. And the farmer says, "Listen, if hang on, if I could tell you what your profession is, can I have it back?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "You're an economist, aren't you?" He goes, "Yeah." "How did you know?" He says, "Because that's my dog you're holding." That's pretty
This
good,
is
huh?
but then exactly without a surprise, what joke is funny?
Right. No.
Or like I don't know, journalists. It was the classic headline was, man bites dog.
Right. Right.
It's surprising,
Yes.
and you talk about Donald Trump. One of the things Donald Trump does brilliantly, often when you read what he says on the page, the dry page, it sounds a bit rambling, not
Yeah.
enormously interesting. But you listen, there's interesting cadence, there's interesting timing. It's quite funny, it's
Mhm.
unexpected turns of phrase. And it's actually, he's basically, he does have good comic timing. Say what you like, pro or con, he uses surprises very effectively. And both in the way he speaks, but also actually, deliberately in international politics as well.
Well, he had decades of practice on TV. Reality TV requires that. Yeah. All right, just for fun,
Hmm.
taking your model of the world research, let's talk about the nature of the self,
Hmm.
consciousness, and free will, just for fun. So, if we have models, and then meta, I can think about thinking about my thinking, and so on.
Yeah.
I have models on top of I have a model of the
Yeah.
physical world, but I have a model of my body and where it is in space, and then I
Yep.
have a model of all those. Do you suspect that something consciousness, or the lights come on, or the dimmer goes up a little higher, the more of these maps you have on top of one another, and at some point you're kind of self-aware, and then that's when consciousness or sentience or whatever word you want to use happens?
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing is that every discussion about consciousness blends into the philosophical, and no one can ever come up with a coherent and pleasing answer.
Right.
Um, that's on one high level, but uh, but then I, for example, as a doctor, dealt with consciousness in a very different, much more practical way. So, say for example, now I can look at your level of consciousness. How conscious are you? Right? You appear to me to be orientated in time, place, and person. I could do other medical jargon. You seem to be, you have a full consciousness, right? And I used to work in the intensive care unit, the neurointensive care unit. I used to go and see patients there, and they would be recovering, say, from a head injury. And it would be, weeks and weeks and weeks. And you would start off and they would be completely unconscious or minimally conscious. Then over time, they would gradually get more and more and more uh, aware of their surroundings. Then, who I was, the fact I came to see them every day or every other day or whatever. They would gradually get more and more and more conscious. Their level of consciousness increased until in the end, hopefully, they would be fully conscious, right? Um, So we can also think about it more practically, sort of levels of consciousness. Now, I think we do have, as humans, enormously sophisticated um, machinery for thinking about our own thinking, for introspecting, for looking at ourselves. Now, it's not infinitely capable. So, for example, you can get to roughly thinking about your thinking about your thinking about your thinking. That's about the limit of what we can do. We can't. I won't go into the science, but you can see you can get people to make decisions, and then you can ask them to reflect on that decision and make a new decision, and then you can ask them to reflect on that decision and make a new decision. And people are above chance; they're better than they would be if they were just random, um, up to about 4 or 5 levels.
Mhm.
That's roughly how good we are, and I think that is it would be very surprising to me if that wasn't um, part of what made us as humans conscious uh, organisms in the way that we are conscious, which is, obviously very sophisticated.
Well, so like your colleague there, Bruce Hood, wrote that book on the illusion of the self. I
Hmm.
don't know. It seems like if at some point you have a model of all the other models, that's me. That's as good as it gets. Even if it's a distributed system and it's
Yeah,
like an iPhone with a bunch of different apps, there's an operating system that kind of runs all the apps, something like
yeah.
that, or a model on top of all the other models, and that's the self.
And what I don't, so I mean, again, I can we could have this. We could probably talk about this literally for about 10 years, and
That's right.
it wouldn't
I know.
necessarily be
I
neither of
know.
us would necessarily be
I know.
correct at the end of that. Um, so what I would say is I would think about it slightly differently, which is that actually, like you, Michael Shermer, are actually, I would say, you're not just that model at the top, the thing that's looking down on everything else. I'd say
Mhm.
you're all of the things.
Okay.
So, the metaphor I use for the brain is that it's like a concert orchestra. So you have the percussion, you have the, wind, you have the brass, you have the strings and so on. You don't get a Beethoven symphony without all of the different parts of that orchestra. And I'd say that in some ways, the capability we have to look at ourselves, to think about our own thinking, in some ways, that's a bit like the conductor of the orchestra. right? Who can say, hold on, guys, you're a bit too loud. Let's stop here. How would Beethoven have wanted us to play this symphony? You know, so, but actually, Michael Shermer is the product of that whole orchestra. And some
Not
of
just
those
the
bits of the
conductor.
orchestra, we're never going to be able to even introspect and think about. Not really, not fully, and control.
Right.
So I'll give you an example of something we'll never. So I'd say, like hiccups. Like you get hiccups. Actually, lots of animals get hiccups. Babies, fetuses get a lot of hiccups. Interestingly, you can never really know why you've got hiccups. You can never really know whether they're going to continue. There is just always a limit to what we can introspect at the lower levels of our brain's hierarchy. And then equally, if we have this incredible machinery, and I think it is machinery within our brains for thinking about our own thinking, how does that think about itself? There comes a point at which what is the top of the hierarchy within our brains? And that in itself is something that is quite remarkable that we humans can think about that. Um, and I think from that actually stems a lot of things like our belief in ultimate purposes, our belief in we need a purpose for our actions. We need explanatory causes for everything that happens in the world. Partly that's because we're using our introspection and we're saying, well, what's at the very top of all of our brain's hierarchies?
Nice. That's a great way to put it. Okay, I'm gonna change my model about that model of the self. All right, last on the trilogy there on free will. Here's how I think about that. So it's
Hmm.
analogous to your prediction error issue in learning. So there philosophical determinists often ask, could you have done otherwise? You rewind the tape, play it back. Could you have gone left instead of right or whatever? Well, first of
Yeah.
all, if it's a read-only memory tape, then no, it's just a recording of what actually happened. So, post-dicting, that's what happened. That's what you did. You can't
Hmm.
change that. So, Heraclitus says you can't step into the same river twice because it's not the same
Hmm.
river and you're not the same
Hmm.
person. So,
Yeah.
going forward, there is no perfect 100% repeat of what already happened. It's
Yeah.
always going to be slightly different, and you can learn from what you did. So, last time I went left, this time I'm going to go right, and you make a
Yeah.
prediction, and an error happens, or a surprise, or you learn, or it
Hmm.
works out, or you're reinforced, or whatever. I think that's about as good as we could do for volition. That's a kind of volition. As long as the universe is not predetermined, say from the Big Bang, it's this
Yeah.
block universe theory or whatever. As long as
Yeah.
it's not that, that you and I were going to have this conversation that was determined 13.8 billion years ago, something like that, right? So I don't think that's the world we live in. I think
Yeah.
the future is not 100% predictable, and therefore we can tweak the variables going forward based on what happened in the past.
Yes. No, I mean, I think you're right. And I think, again, it's a bit like thinking about consciousness. You can think about it very philosophically.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, I'm literally, when I was a junior doctor, I walked around the neuro ITU and I had to measure somebody's level of consciousness and write it on a scale from literally, from 1 to 10.
Hmm.
Um, and it, there is, I think for a wide variety of reasons as well, society can't, I mean, this isn't, if people do not believe they are at least minimally responsible for their actions, then how can society function? Um, so, and that's you look at the basics of tribes where they have to raid other tribes to get food. Um, it is better if you let the other members of the raiding party do the dangerous business of attacking the other tribe, and you're the coward who hangs back. That's probably better for you. You've made that choice. You have the free will to do that. But for example, in the Turkana tribe in northern Kenya, if you do that and it is discovered, you will be punished by the other members of your tribe. Uh, and you might be tied to a bush and beaten. And in addition to that, the women in the tribe will not see you as an attractive marriage partner because you're a coward. Um, Even there, I doubt that they were having enormously, that they weren't talking about Heraclitus and all the rest of it.
Right.
Um, but there is the idea that that person chose to be a coward.
Yeah.
And it's obviously more complicated than that. we all are, hugely influenced by society and all the rest of it, and that is enormously important. But I
Well,
think there has to be an element of agency.
we all assume other people have or other people are determined, and we have free will to shape them the way we want. Or as I sometimes like to say, no determinist I've met actually believes it in their real life when they're walking around.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like when you were talking about, money has no value. I remember there was a guy who went, and this is a true story. I was like, this guy was saying we can abolish nuclear weapons. And I first moved to Washington, D.C., and he's like, I went to this talk, and this guy's going, we can abolish nuclear weapons. And everyone's sitting there taking very seriously. And he was like, this dollar bill has no value unless we all agree it has value. And that was, broadly speaking, his argument.
Yeah.
But then, and it is true that nuclear weapons have value to at least reasonable degrees. We believe they have value, and we all agree to that. On the other hand, if you let off a nuclear weapon, medium-sized nuclear warhead in Lower Manhattan, a lot of people are going to die. Just as you said, determinists don't actually live their lives like that. Nobody actually thinks cars coming towards them are figments of the imagination.
Right.
They actually do pay attention to that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. They're made of atoms, and atoms are mostly empty space. So don't worry about it.
Exactly. My nose doesn't exist. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so let's wrap up on that as an interesting topic. How do you get to nuclear zero? I've seen pathways there. It seems to me the security dilemma, the Hobbesian trap, or the other guy problem. Back to where we started when you commented about people that countries that don't have armies are more likely to get invaded by those that do. Does North Korea have nuclear weapons because the United States doesn't invade countries that have nuclear weapons? I mean, it's a form of defense and deterrence, and it works.
Yeah, but I think, it's also important. I think this is a great, and this is an important theme of the book, and I think this is actually an important thing we should all try and remember is that in many ways this is actually a really positive story. People I remember there was the prediction during John F. Kennedy's presidency was, well, there will be huge nuclear proliferation. By the end of the 1960s, loads of countries will have nuclear weapons. Very few countries have nuclear weapons, and this is now a 80-year-old technology. This is not that complicated to do. And yet very few countries have nuclear weapons. So I think actually it's quite a positive story. I think, could we persuade Russia plausibly in the next, whilst Vladimir Putin or his immediate successors are in charge, to remove their nuclear weapons? I think the chance of that is absolutely not. It's utterly implausible to me. The same thing with China's Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, China is currently ramping up its nuclear arsenal. And whilst they have nuclear weapons, we, in the broadest sense, also need nuclear weapons, because if we don't have nuclear weapons, then we are subject to nuclear blackmail. But that said, one of the reasons why Italy doesn't need nuclear weapons, why lots of the countries in the map behind me don't need nuclear weapons, is partly because the United States is protecting them using its nuclear weapons. So, and then that comes down to trust. That comes down to, how does Xi Jinping feel about, whether or not the United States would actually come to the aid of Japan if the nuclear issue really became, a very serious one. And you get down to all of these psychological issues again, issues around the brains of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and, Japanese leaders. I know the Prime Minister resigned very recently, so I'm going to get his name wrong with the new chap. So I don't think for the foreseeable future, for my children's lifetimes, that we will get rid of nuclear weapons. It just seems utterly implausible.
Yeah. Do you know that story when George Shultz was meeting with Margaret Thatcher, explaining to her that Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, and he said, "I found out what it means to be handbagged by Margaret."
Yeah.
Are you out of your mind?
The thing is just that we lived in, until relatively recently, we lived in many ways the best part of human history that had ever been. But now we're back in history. There are people who want to invade other countries and take them over. And we need to defend ourselves. Other people need to defend ourselves. And a key part of how people defend themselves in our time is nuclear weapons. But again, I think we should also be I'm optimistic because actually we've lived with nuclear weapons for a long time. We've got a huge number of safeguards in place now. No one has used a nuclear weapon in anger since literally August 1945. Most countries don't have nuclear weapons. So I think there are lots of reasons to be very positive. And that's not being optimistic just because I think everyone's lovely in the world and we can all get along, and if we just are nice to each other and give each other hugs. Lots of people aren't very nice in the world, and we can still get along, and we haven't had a nuclear war, and most countries don't have nuclear weapons. And I think that's a reason to be optimistic that we can actually live in a thriving, successful world, even with nuclear weapons.
I concur. That's a perfect place to end it. Nicholas Wright, here is the book, Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. Great read, super interesting stuff, especially if you love all that World War II stuff and neuroscience stuff, which is equally interesting. Thank you so much for your work. This is really important.
Thank you, Michael.
And, keep meeting with the Pentagon people. we need more scientists in there.
Thank you, Michael. It was brilliant. Thanks a lot.